Now, we have a retirement crisis in this country, but it may not be what you think it is. We talk about that a lot on this program, and my next guest has written an excellent column about that. Eric Levitz is a columnist for New York Magazine's Intelligencer page, and he's written a piece. He wrote it the other day. It was headlined, "Social Security Isn't Going Broke. Older Americans are." So first of all, Eric, thanks for coming on the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Secondly, it looked to me like the inspiration for this piece, I mean, you include a lot of excellent statistics about the state of retirement in this country, but it looked to me like maybe the trigger for writing it was a piece in the New York Times. Was that what got you thinking about doing this column?
Yeah, there was a piece in the Times that raised some alarm about the fact that the Social Security is going to begin taking in less money through payroll taxes than it's going to pay out in benefits this year or next, and that this puts it on a trajectory towards liquidating its trust fund by 20 years from now, essentially. And so my piece was sort of pointing out that really this is putting the focus on the wrong issue. It's not really, we don't really have a crisis as far as we have a government program that can fully pay for itself for 20 years, and then the richest country in the history of the earth is going to have to figure out a new revenue scheme for it. That's really not that big a deal. The bigger problem is the fact that even the existing program is proving insufficient for a lot of Americans at a time when the cost of retiring, the cost of medical care, and life expectancy is going up, and private savings and access to private pensions is going down. And so, really, the problem here is one, the insufficiency of the current program, and two, the fact that nonetheless there still is this ethos that actually the responsible thing for policymakers to do is to cut benefits and reform entitlement spending.
One of the things that fascinates me about this whole debate, there are really two elements to the problem, and I think you've articulated them well, Eric. One is, what is the nature of the real retirement crisis? And the other is what to me seems like the extraordinary tenacity of this mistaken narrative, or this narrative that fixates on concerns about the deficit, concerns about the financing dimension of this, rather than the human dimension of the crisis we have on our hands. This, as you know, Eric Levitz, this sort of political / media obsession on the fiscal dimension of the crisis instead of the human dimension of the crisis. That's the way I would put it. Was a key part of the political environment in 2010, 2011, 2012. It was a key part of the grand bargain that Barack Obama tried to strike with John Boehner that would have included reductions to an already meager set of benefits in Social Security. And yet, even as the political winds have shifted in certain ways, and there's more talk about expanding Social Security, it seems to me that it's just impossible to dislodge our major newspapers from presenting the situation the way they presented it in the article you quote. I mean, what are your thoughts about that? One, do you agree with my interpretation? And two, if so, why do you think that might be?
Yeah, well, I totally agree. I think that there has definitely been actually significant progress from the grand bargain days. You'll notice that I think maybe there's like John Delaney, the one congressman, but pretty much almost every single one of the Democrats, nearly 24 presidential candidates, none of them are talking about austerity. None of them are running on centering the budget deficit or at all broaching the subject of Social Security and Medicare cuts. And really worshiping the budget deficit was a significant strain within the Democratic Party. Really since I think Bill Clinton's years, when there was this association that his budget tightening measures played some central role in sparking the boom of the late 90s. And so this became kind of Democratic orthodoxy for a little while, but it really has started to fade. the Times piece, it's overall the thrust of it is that it does send this message to the reader in terms of the balance of the quotes in it, that the responsible thing for policymakers in both parties to do is to come together and agree to some tax increases and some benefit cuts. That said, perhaps unlike a similar piece written a few years ago, even within this piece, they do ultimately quote the progressive perspective. They reference the fact that some Democrats are calling for expanding benefits, and they do put more emphasis on the consequences of. They sort of frame the problem as, if we don't do anything, then what's going to happen in 2030. 6 or whatever is that we're going to have 20% across the board benefit cuts, and that's going to be really bad because our retirees really are not in such great financial shape. And so it does gesture at the actual problem and does gesture at progressive solutions to it, even if it doesn't emphasize those, which I think is progress over how the mainstream media was covering these issues a few years ago.
So let's talk a little bit about the dimensions of the problem as it currently exists, which you used as your lead. I think that was I approve of that, because it seems to me that's the part of the story that doesn't get enough coverage or enough attention, even still. And you're right, there's been progress, but the elderly, at least some of the elderly, are living longer. America's getting older, private pensions are disappearing. And I'm quoting you now, working class wage growth has long been middling. Yeah, middling is a good word. Cost of healthcare is soaring, and that's a big deal for seniors, of course, and disabled people on Social Security. Birth rate is plummeting, and so on. Do we really, I called it a retirement crisis. Do you think we have a retirement crisis on our hands?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the term crisis, is inherently subjective, what one finds unacceptable and what one doesn't. But the way that I look at it, we know right now that the median household that's led by someone between the ages of 55 and 64 has about $12,000 in its retirement accounts. We know, again, that older people are living longer than they used to, but not necessarily are they able to work longer. I think that there's a bias that is reflected in a lot of the discourse around Social Security and Medicare that comes from the fact that the people who make policy are white-collar professionals who, in many cases, can work comfortably into their later years. But a lot of Americans perform blue-collar or hard labor, and really the toll that takes on a person are not able to, work longer just because their life expectancy or Americans' overall life expectancy is going up. And so we have people that we need to support in their older years that made contributions to our society, and we're going to need to support them for longer than in previous eras. We're going to need to support them when they have less support from private employers than in previous eras, and when medical care, healthcare costs are going up, as we all know, year upon year, and that's especially acute among older Americans, where you have some breakthrough treatments for certain ailments that disproportionately afflict older people, and pharmaceutical companies can really price gouge on these treatments, and so the expenses are very significant. And then you have that combined with the fact that we've had falling birth rates, and the population that is going to have to support our older folks is smaller than the population that's retiring, or the generation is. And so there is a real problem here. The fiscal. My point is that the budget problem is overhyped because we have choices that we could make, and polls show that Americans would rather cut back on military spending to invest more in our seniors, that they would be open to taxing the rich more to do so. There are choices that need to be made because of the fact that we have growing obligations to fulfill. But the idea that the solution to this is to cut spending is actually how one would bury your head in the sand, how our government would bury its head in the sands. Because when you take the cost of supporting the elderly off of Uncle Sam's books, they don't disappear. It just requires people's family members, children, friends to support them, or it requires condemning them to poverty. And so it's really no solution at all.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And again, we're talking with Eric Levitz, who is a columnist for New York Magazine's Intelligencer. one of the things that strikes me, and this may be a little bit parenthetical, Eric, but I keep noticing it, is that you have these groups of people. Some of them are paid think tankers, some of them are politicians or media pundits or whatever, who keep talking in alarmist terms about the ratio of retirees to active workers, but very few of those people are talking, for example, about dramatically liberalizing our immigration laws so that we can have more workers per retiree than we're projected to have. It seems to me that one of the solutions to this, one of the policy approaches we could take is to say, well, let's get more immigration rather than less so that we make sure we have a thriving economy with active workers in it. What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think that, the one objection that one might raise to that is that, well, you've seen how hard a time Congress has passing any immigration reform whatsoever, including, totally non-controversial or ones that poll well across parties, such as giving legal status to Dreamers. So how on earth are they going to, radically expand legal immigration? At the same time, though, that same problem applies to, all our options here. It's not the case that there's overwhelming public support for cutting Social Security and Medicare benefits. So, a hard choice or a politically difficult choice is going to have to be made. And I see no evidence that Americans are more comfortable with the idea of slashing Social Security than they are in expanding immigration. In fact, polls have suggested that since Trump took office, possibly in reaction to him, Americans are becoming more and more liberal on immigration policy. And so I think that, if there's going to be a difficult political choice that we have to make, why not make the one that objectively, even from a technocratic perspective, would be better? Pretty much no economist is going to tell you in the abstract it would not be good for the productivity of our economy to take workers who have been trained and accrued human capital in other countries and allow them to come here and work and be productive in our country to help us support our aging population. That's unambiguously good economics. And so, if we're going to have to do something difficult politically, why don't we do the right thing substantively?
And it seems to me that the same people who argue about, and we could get into the issues of to what extent can we tolerate deficits and those types of things. But even leaving that aside for a moment, it seems to me that the same people who argue basically for our inability to tolerate deficits or further deficit spending are the people who avoid where that conversation should logically take us, in my mind anyway, which is, well, okay, if we only have X, if we accept your hypothesis, if we only have X amount, a pool of dollars to spend, which is there must be some limit after which that becomes true, theoretically, I guess. If we only have X number of dollars, then we should we spend it on this? Should we spend it on that? Should we encourage growth? If so, how? Immigration is one dimension of that. You mentioned cutting back on defense spending, which is extravagant. You mentioned Scandinavia as living proof that you can have more generous retirement plans. But those, you also mentioned the word just now, technocratic. It seems to me that people who argue that there are technocratic solutions to our problems, that is, you don't have to get into the messy politics, just let us engineer this thing, are the same people who don't want to have that decision, and I'm being a little unfair, but I don't think too much, who don't want to have that decision, that discussion about, well, then what do we do about runaway defense spending? If we really, unless we want to condemn a large chunk of our elderly population and one child in five and so on, we could go bring other social programs into poverty, then that's a conversation we need to have. I guess in closing, I would ask Eric Levitz, why do you think we're not having that conversation?
Yeah, I think that hopefully we're going to move toward it. Maybe the Democratic debates, the Democratic primary race will force that issue. But I do think that I agree with what you're saying, that overall most of the discourse around Social Security and Medicare is driven, I think, by a conscious desire to take what is a very unpopular position among the mass public, but very popular among a certain group of technocratic elites and invested financial interests, and pose what is a fundamentally deeply political question as a purely mathematical, apolitical, technical question, so as to avoid the fact that it is so unpopular. If you can frame your desired policies as simply what is dictated by math or objective reality, then you don't actually have to engage a substantive argument that, no, actually it's more important to keep the military-industrial complex growing steadily year upon year than it is to keep our older people out of poverty. They don't want to have that conversation, and so the more that you can create an environment where it seems like, well, all serious people know that it's just a fact that we can't sustain this program, the more you can do that, the more you can avoid actually getting into a losing argument about the values that we're actually trying to affirm with our budgets.
And that's the mindset I think that we're fighting against. I mean, first solve for X, but people forget that the person who wrote the test is the person who decided everything that leads into the conclusion of X, finding out what X is. They write the questions, and they get the answer is predetermined. And that's why articles like yours are a welcome corrective to what I consider, and I'll take your point, in improving, but still limited debate on this subject. So Eric Levitz, columnist for New York Magazine's Intelligencer, I appreciate your work on this, and thank you for coming on the program.
Yep, thanks a lot.